What if I told you that one of England's most controversial kings, a man who would eventually lose his head on a scaffold, was hiding a secret so scandalous that it could have torn his kingdom apart before civil war even had the chance? Charles I, the king who believed in the divine right of monarchs, who went to war with his own parliament, who died insisting he was God's appointed ruler, was also a man desperately, dangerously in love with someone he could never publicly claim. This isn't the story they teach you in history books. This is about forbidden desire, palace whispers, and a relationship so explosive that even mentioning it could mean treason. Because in 17th century England, some loves were more dangerous than any rebellion. Before we dive into this untold chapter of royal history, I need you to smash that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the secrets they tried to bury, the scandals they erased from official records, and the human stories behind the crowns. And drop a comment telling me, can love ever be worth risking everything? Your throne, your reputation, even your life? Because Charles I made choices that still shock us 400 years later. Now, let's go back to 1625, to a newly crowned king, a kingdom watching his every move, and a passion that could destroy everything he'd been born to protect.
Charles Stuart became King of England, Scotland, and Ireland on March 27, 1625, at the age of 24. He was not supposed to be king. That destiny belonged to his older brother Henry, the golden prince everyone adored, the charming heir who seemed born to rule. But Henry died of typhoid fever in 1612, and suddenly shy, stuttering Charles, the sickly second son who could barely get through a sentence without stumbling over his words, was thrust into a role he'd never been prepared for. His father, James I, had mostly ignored him, favoring Henry and lavishing attention on his court favorites, handsome young men who whispered in the king's ear and received titles, lands, and affections that made the entire court uncomfortable. Charles watched all of this, learned from it, and told himself he would be different. He would be a proper king, a faithful husband, a man of God and duty. He would not shame the crown the way his father had. In 1625, just months into his reign, Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, a 15-year-old Catholic princess with dark eyes and a fierce spirit. It was a political marriage, of course. All royal marriages were. The union was meant to strengthen ties with France and secure England's position in the complex web of European alliances. But something unexpected happened. Charles actually fell in love with his wife. Not immediately. Those first years were rocky, filled with arguments over religion, over her French attendance, over her refusal to participate in Protestant ceremonies. But gradually, genuinely, Charles became devoted to Henrietta Maria in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. He wrote her love letters, commissioned paintings of her, spent hours in her chambers discussing art, music, and philosophy. The court whispered that the king was bewitched by his Catholic queen, that she had too much influence over him. But Charles didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, understood, cherished. But here's what the official histories don't tell you. There was someone else. Someone who'd been there long before Henrietta Maria, someone who knew Charles in ways his wife never could, someone whose presence in the king's life was so dangerous that every letter, every gift, every stolen moment had to be carefully concealed. His name was George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham. Now, if you know your history, you're thinking, wait, wasn't Buckingham the favorite of Charles's father, James I? Yes, exactly. George Villiers had been the most powerful man in England during James's reign, his lover in everything but name, the man who controlled access to the king and accumulated more wealth and power than any nobleman in generations. And when James died and Charles became king, everyone expected Buckingham to fall from grace. Instead, something shocking happened. Charles kept him. Not just as an advisor, not just as a political ally, but as his closest companion, his most trusted confidant, the one person he'd turn to for everything. The relationship between Charles and Buckingham was intense in a way that made the entire court nervous. They traveled together, hunted together, spent hours locked in private chambers where no one else was admitted. Charles gave Buckingham estates, titles, and more influence than any subject should have over a king. When Parliament tried to impeach Buckingham for corruption and military failures, Charles dissolved Parliament rather than allow it to happen. When critics whispered about the unnatural closeness between the king and the duke, Charles responded with fury, defending Buckingham as my true and faithful friend. But here's the question no one dared ask out loud. Was it just friendship? Or was Charles I, the king who would become famous for his rigid morality and his belief in divine kingship, hiding the same kind of passionate, all-consuming relationship his father had with the same man? And if so, what did that mean for his marriage, his kingdom, and his soul? Because in 1625, being accused of sodomy wasn't just a scandal, it was a crime punishable by death, even for a king. And someone was about to make sure everyone knew the truth.
The first years of Charles's reign were marked by political disasters, failed military campaigns, conflicts with Parliament, religious tensions that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. But behind the closed doors of Whitehall Palace, a different kind of crisis was brewing. Henrietta Maria, young and passionate and fiercely intelligent, had begun to notice something that filled her with a jealousy she could barely contain: her husband's devotion to George Villiers. It wasn't just that Buckingham had influence over Charles. She expected that. Powerful nobles always surrounded kings. It was the intimacy between them. The way Charles's entire face would light up when Buckingham entered a room. The way he touched the Duke's shoulder with a familiarity he never showed anyone else, not even her. The way he defended Buckingham against all criticism, even when it was destroying his relationship with Parliament and making him look weak. One evening in 1627, Henrietta Maria confronted Charles directly. They were in his private chambers, and she had just learned that Charles had given Buckingham yet another estate, this one worth thousands of pounds, while she was being told the royal treasury couldn't afford new tapestries for her rooms. "Why?" she demanded, her French accent thickening with emotion. "Why does he receive everything while I must beg for scraps? What does he give you that I cannot?" Charles stiffened, his stammer returning the way it always did when he felt cornered. He is my friend, my most loyal servant. He has been with me through everything." Henrietta Maria stepped closer, her dark eyes blazing. "Your father's lover, you mean? The man who shared his bed, who controlled him like a puppet? Is that what you want, Charles? To be controlled the same way?" The accusation hung in the air between them, explosive, unforgivable. Charles's face went pale, then red with fury. "How dare you? You know nothing of loyalty, of true friendship. Your mind is poisoned by Catholic superstition and French gossip." But Henrietta Maria wasn't finished. "I know what I see. I know that you spend more time with him than with me. I know that you defend him when the entire kingdom calls for his head. I know," she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I know the way you look at him, Charles, and so does everyone else." That conversation ended with Charles storming out, leaving his young wife in tears. But she had planted a seed of fear in him, because she was right. People were talking. The court had always gossiped about the relationship between the king and his favorite, but now the whispers were growing louder, more dangerous. Puritan preachers were delivering sermons about the sin of sodomy, about how God punished kingdoms whose rulers fell into unnatural vices. Pamphlets were being circulated in London, crude and vicious, depicting Charles and Buckingham in compromising positions, calling them Sodom's princes. Parliament was using the relationship as ammunition, arguing that a king controlled by his passions, whether for a man or a woman, was unfit to rule. And foreign ambassadors were sending reports back to their governments describing the English court as morally corrupt, weak, led by a king who couldn't control his desires.
Charles knew he had to do something. He had to prove to his kingdom, to his wife, to God himself, that he was a righteous king, a faithful husband, a man of unshakable moral character. But how could he do that without giving up the one person who truly understood him? Buckingham, for his part, seemed oblivious to the danger. Or maybe he just didn't care. He had spent years as the most powerful man in England, first under James, now under Charles, and he had grown arrogant, convinced of his own invincibility. He threw lavish parties, flirted openly with women at court to maintain appearances, and continued to treat Charles with a familiar affection that made everyone uncomfortable. But in private, alone with Charles, he was different. He was tender, attentive, speaking to the king in a way no one else dared, not as a subject to his monarch, but as one soul to another. "They don't understand us," Buckingham would tell Charles during their long evenings together. "They never could. What we have transcends their petty morality, their small minds. You are a king chosen by God, and I am the one God placed at your side. Nothing else matters." And Charles, desperate to believe him, would nod and feel for a moment that maybe it was true. Maybe their bond was divinely ordained, something pure and sacred that the world was too corrupt to recognize. But the world was closing in. In August 1628, everything changed. Buckingham was in Portsmouth, preparing another military expedition, when a disgruntled soldier named John Felton walked into the house where the Duke was staying and stabbed him in the chest. Buckingham died almost instantly, his blood soaking into the floor of a rented room hundreds of miles from the king he had served and loved. When the news reached Charles, he was in chapel. A messenger whispered in his ear, and those who were there said the king's face went completely blank, as if his soul had left his body. He stood up mechanically, walked to his chambers, locked the door, and for 2 days refused to see anyone, not his advisors, not his servants, not even Henrietta Maria. He stayed in that room alone, and the sounds of his weeping could be heard through the heavy wooden door.
For weeks after Buckingham's death, Charles was a ghost, haunting his own palace. He performed his duties mechanically, signed documents, attended council meetings, received ambassadors, but anyone who looked into his eyes could see that something fundamental had broken inside him. Henrietta Maria, surprisingly, showed him kindness during this time. Perhaps she understood that grief transcends jealousy, or perhaps she simply saw an opportunity to finally have her husband's full attention. She sat with him during his darkest moments, held his hand when he woke from nightmares, and never once mentioned Buckingham's name unless Charles brought it up first. And slowly, painfully, something shifted between them. Charles began to turn to his wife for the companionship he had lost, and what had started as a political arrangement gradually transformed into genuine partnership. But the shadow of Buckingham never really left. Charles commissioned a massive monument for the Duke, ignoring Parliament's protests about the expense. He kept Buckingham's letters locked in a private chest that no one else was allowed to touch. He wore a miniature portrait of the Duke on a chain around his neck, hidden under his clothing where only he could feel it against his heart. And late at night, when insomnia plagued him, he would take out those letters and read them by candlelight, remembering a time when he had felt truly understood. The content of those letters has been debated by historians for centuries. Were they simply the effusive expressions of male friendship common in that era? Or were they something more? Coded declarations of a love that could never speak its name. The truth died with Charles because years later, as he prepared for his execution, he burned most of those letters, making sure no one would ever know what had truly existed between him and George Villiers. Parliament thought Buckingham's death would make Charles easier to control. Without his favorite whispering in his ear, surely the king would become more reasonable, more willing to compromise. But they were wrong. If anything, Buckingham's death made Charles more stubborn, more convinced of his divine right to rule without interference.
He refused to call Parliament for 11 years, ruling through what became known as the personal rule, making decisions alone, trusting no one the way he had trusted Buckingham. And when war finally came, when Scotland rebelled and Parliament demanded power and the kingdom spiraled into civil war, some whispered that it all traced back to that relationship, to a king who had learned too well from his father how to love the wrong person, and who could never forgive the world for taking that person away. But here's the twist that history often glosses over. The man who killed Buckingham, John Felton, became a folk hero. Common people celebrated him in taverns, wrote ballads about him, called him a patriot who had saved England from the king's corruption. And when Felton was interrogated about his motives, he said something chilling. "I killed him not just for his military failures, not just for his corruption, but because his influence over the king was unnatural, ungodly, and had to be stopped." He was speaking in code. Everyone knew it. He was saying what no one else dared say, that the relationship between Charles and Buckingham was sexual, that it was sinful, that it was destroying the moral fabric of the kingdom. And the fact that so many people celebrated Felton's action meant that many agreed with him. Charles was facing a kingdom that thought his love, whatever form it took, was not just scandalous, but genuinely dangerous, a sign that God had turned his face away from England. The final irony? Years later, when Charles was on trial for his life, when Parliament accused him of tyranny and treason, one of the unspoken charges hanging in the air was his relationship with Buckingham. They never said it explicitly, even regicides had some sense of decorum, but everyone in that courtroom knew. The king's inability to control his passions, his preferential treatment of favorites, his stubborn defense of the indefensible, it all traced back to those intense, complicated feelings for a man who had been dead for over 20 years. And as Charles prepared to meet his executioner, some say he touched that hidden miniature portrait one last time, remembering not his wife, not his children, not his kingdom, but the one person he had loved completely and could never have publicly claimed. On January 30, 1649, King Charles I walked onto a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace. He wore 2 shirts. It was a cold day, and he didn't want to shiver and have people think he was afraid. In his final moments, he spoke about duty, about divine right, about how he died a good Christian. But those closest to the scaffold reported something strange. Just before the axe fell, Charles touched something under his shirt, over his heart. A small gesture, barely noticeable. Was it a prayer? A final farewell to the wife he had eventually learned to love? Or was it that miniature portrait of George Villiers, the man whose memory he had carried for 2 decades, the relationship that had shaped his entire reign in ways he could never acknowledge? Henrietta Maria, who had fled to France years earlier to escape the Civil War, lived for another 20 years. She never remarried, never returned to England permanently. In her later letters, she occasionally mentioned Buckingham, always carefully, always in the context of political history. But once, in a letter to her daughter, she wrote something revealing. "Your father loved deeply and completely, but he loved what he could not have, not just power unchallenged, but a freedom to be himself that no king is ever granted. I like to think that in his final moments, he found that freedom at last." Was she speaking about his relationship with Buckingham? We'll never know for certain. But it's clear that even decades later, she understood that Charles had been a man torn between duty and desire, between the public role he had to play and the private self he could never fully express. The historical record is deliberately vague about the true nature of Charles and Buckingham's relationship. Letters were destroyed, accounts were sanitized, and later historians, especially Victorian ones, worked hard to frame everything as passionate friendship or Renaissance male bonding. But if you read between the lines, if you look at Charles's actions rather than his words, a different story emerges.
This was a man who risked his relationship with Parliament, with his wife, with his entire kingdom to protect and elevate one person. A man who grieved for years over that person's death with an intensity that shocked even those who loved him. A man who, at the moment of his own death, carried a token of that relationship literally over his heart. Maybe it was romantic love. Maybe it was something else, a bond forged in childhood trauma, a dependency born from being the ignored second son who finally found someone who saw him. Maybe in 17th century terms, it was something we don't even have a name for today. What we do know is this: Charles I lived in a time when being true to certain kinds of love could literally cost you your kingdom and your head. He watched his father, James I, flout convention with his male favorites and saw how it diminished the crown's dignity. He tried to be different, to be proper, to be the righteous king his subjects demanded, but he couldn't or wouldn't give up George Villiers. And that decision, that refusal to conform to what was expected, ultimately contributed to the catastrophic breakdown between king and parliament that led to civil war. Some historians argue that the English Civil War was about religion, or taxation, or constitutional principles. And yes, all of that is true, but it was also, at least partially, about a king who could never fully explain why he made the choices he made, because the truth, that he was motivated by love, by loyalty, by feelings that his society considered criminal, was unspeakable. So here's my question for you. Was Charles I a martyr who died for his principles? Or was he a man whose hidden passions blinded him to political reality? Was his love for Buckingham noble or destructive? And most importantly, in a world that demanded he choose between being who he was expected to be and honoring what he truly felt, did he make the right choice? History can't answer that, but maybe you can. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this story made you see this controversial king in a new light, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold histories. Because the past isn't as simple as they taught us in school. It's messy, complicated, and full of people who loved dangerously, lived authentically, and paid the ultimate price for both. Charles I lost his head, but he never lost that miniature portrait he wore over his heart. And maybe that's the real story. Not the king who died for divine right, but the man who lived and died for a love he could never name.